discussing the principles of design, which are the rules used to organize the visual elements. We think of the elements as the elements of art because these are physical things, tools that you can use to create an artwork. Lines and shapes, different colors, mass, volume, things that physically go into the artwork. But the things we're learning today are design principles, rules, and concepts that help organize an artwork to make it more successful and ensure that it will be visually pleasing for the viewer. Now, that doesn't ensure that your aesthetics are going to be the same as the artist's, but if they follow the principles, and artists are definitely taught to do this, it will ensure success for the greatest number, right? Now, this doesn't mean you have to like everything, and it's good to dislike some things and have an opinion, and that's one of the things we learn in this class. But today we're learning about the objective principles, and when we learn about the elements and principles, this is not where we place our opinion, right? This is how it doesn't matter what we like or dislike, we can still objectively look at an artwork and decide if they're using these things appropriately or not. And that's what we want to focus on today. So, just like the elements, a lot of these words are things that we already know, but it's important to understand how the artist uses them. So, repetition is just when you find an element more than once in an artwork. Now, this can be an element of art, so where the artist is repeating a circle or a square, um, the same color again and again in the artwork, something along those lines. But it could also be like a tree in a forest, or the texture of the bark in the forest that you can discuss as the fact that the artist has chosen to repeat that again and again. Sometimes this can be a way that the artist is choosing to guide you through an artwork. And a lot of times this is something that they do to help unify the artwork. Now, that repetition, if it creates a decorative or something decorative, a motif or a design, in that repetition, then it's a pattern. There's lots of patterns that you guys already know because we wear them in our clothing and we put them up in our homes for curtains and things like that. But these are things that you can just name, and we know that they're a pattern, right? The artist is using a striped curtain to create contrast against ... So if you mention the stripe, or you mention the plaid, or you mention the floral design, the floral pattern, sometimes you don't have to use that word pattern if it has a specific name. But an artist can also create a pattern by creating a repetitive design, right? This doesn't have to have a name. The way that the artist puts those trees in the artwork, if they're in a systematic way, if there's the same amount of spacing between each one, that is a repetitive design. And so there is pattern in that, say, landscaping. And so it's important to understand that an artist will create patterns out of different things, not just the types of patterns that we're exposed to in our clothing design. Though the pattern I have to show you is one that you're familiar with. Here we see stripes, but it's not a plain stripe. If you look at, we don't have a bold, hard line here, right? And a hard line would be that straight, hard edge, meaning that there's no ripple or something in it like we see here. Notice how it starts thinner at the bottom of the canvas, down here, but as we move up, that yellow gets thicker and thicker, and that starts to create a little bit of visual interest, right? It makes it more interesting to look at. It creates a different space of the narrow part of the yellow-orange, and this darker orange, it also gets narrower as we move up because of the spacing here. And so this becomes something interesting to look at, even though it's something very simple. And you can see this little sentence I put at the top. This is just an example of how you would explain this principle in the artwork. The repetition of the painted lines creates a pattern of stripes. You could also say creates stripes. So notice how we've also explained one of the elements in here. So the repetition of the painted line creates stripes. Now you've gotten credit for repetition, you've gotten credit for pattern, and you've gotten credit for an element because you're explaining the element there. Now we move from that to scale and proportion. Now scale and proportion kind of have the same concept, but one is relation to other things and one is in relation to itself. And so it's important because this is one of the big things that students get wrong. They will mix match scale and proportion. Scale is the overall size of an artwork. So notice it's the size of the entire artwork. This is the overall size. And we relate that size to another thing. Usually our own size is how we best understand it, unless it's smaller than we are. And as you see, I've given you two examples here of ways to describe the scale when you don't have dimensions. Is it life size, meaning it's the size that it would be in life? This is appropriate for things that are larger. If it's like a strawberry that was painted life size for a strawberry, that's still very small, right? And so we would talk about that artwork as a small artwork, not a life size artwork. Or is it larger than life? Is it monumental? Right? There's different ways to describe it, but larger than life, life size, monumental, these are three standard ways to describe artwork in the art world. Now notice up here I talk about, is it small and intimate? And I want you to really understand this. When an artwork is very small, imagine this as a photograph, right? I have it pictured here almost like a Polaroid, and I do that on purpose. I want you to imagine it like about the size of a Polaroid and hanging on the wall in a museum. Now, would you want to get up really close to that to look at it and view it, or would you view it further away? And when you consider that, obviously, you guys are all thinking, I would want to get up close to it or I wouldn't see any of the details, right? And that's the point. Now, if it's really this small on a gallery wall and you have to get really close to it to see it, now is your head then blocking it out so that no one else can view it at the same time, right? And so then it becomes an intimate view, right? The artist has created something very intimate for a viewer to look at because only one person can look at it at the same time. Whereas a monument, say Mount Rushmore, or just a large scale painting, the larger it is, the further back you stand from it because you want to see the whole thing. And so more and more people, the larger it is, can view it at once. And so it takes away that intimacy. Scale is the first decision the artist makes when they start to create the artwork. They might brainstorm ideas about the artwork beforehand, but the first decision they make is what is the right size for the artwork. And scale is important because the message that they want to get across starts in the scale. And so that's where that word intimate comes in. Proportion is when you are relating the size of parts in the artwork to the whole, or size of parts of the artwork to other parts of the artwork. Now here I have a man that's climbed Mount Rushmore, and he's standing here with Lincoln's head. So the scale would be when we compare the man versus the whole head, right? We're comparing Mount Rushmore. I know we're only seeing a small part of it, but we're comparing the size of it to an outside force. So we're looking at the size of the artwork versus the size of something else. And you really get a sense of the scale of it, especially if you consider that there's 4 heads there, and we're only seeing one of them here. Now, proportion would be if we compare the size of this nose to the size of the head. It would also be if we're comparing the nose to the size of the eye, or the brow, or the lip. Now, one mistake that students often make is when they're looking at something two-dimensional, they go back to that word scale when, say, they are comparing a tree in the foreground. They talk about the scale of the tree in comparison to, say, the scale of a mountain in the background. But again, you are relating two things in the artwork. These are not whole separate concepts, right? These are two parts of the same artwork. That's not a singular tree off in the real world and a mountain in the real world. Even if it's a photograph, remember, this is still a conceived space in 2 dimensions. We have the proportions of that tree to the proportions of the mountain. Now, what I want you to think about this is, if you compare the proportions of the tree, the size of that tree, to the proportions, the size of that mountain, and how far away they appear, that's going to help you understand the depth of that piece, right? That's going to help you really start to understand the space between the tree and that mountain. And so this is how we start to understand space in an artwork, is through those proportions. And so it's important for you to understand that scale is only when you're referring to the overall size of the entire artwork, not different parts of it. Now, the next principle that I like to discuss is variety, because I have these kind of listed in order of difficulty of understanding, because that I find seems to be a really good way of making sure that you understand the concepts really well. Variety is simply having elements that are different in the artwork. There's different shapes, different thicknesses of lines, different textures, lots of colors. And what variety does is it creates what we call visual interest. And that makes the artwork more intriguing. So you need variety in the artwork, but too much variety in an artwork, if it only has variety, then it won't seem cohesive. It doesn't make sense together. So something has to bring the variety together. So I just want to show you this here. This is Shastia Sikander's Hood's Red Rider #2, which is part of series On My Head or In Your Mind. And if you look, we've got lots of different shapes. There's circles and triangles, lots of organic shapes, people, half of peoples, lots of other organic shapes as well. And so we've got the geometric and the organic shapes. Now, we've got the different people, right? And the thing that I want you to look at is we've also got a variety of colors happening here as well. And the thing is that the variety of lines, colors, and shapes help make this a really interesting artwork, because you have to look at it for a long time to even start to make sense of it. But what I want you to pay attention to now for just a moment is we've learned about color and color schemes, and this definitely has a color scheme. So the first thing you learn is to list the colors that are there. So we've got some green, we've got some light orange, we've got red, and some yellow oranges. We've got a little bit of violet. But the majority of the artwork, let's just kind of really look, the majority of this artwork is analogous. It's made up of that yellow, orange, orange, and red. And I'm sure as you see that, you'll agree. Now, I want you to look at the variety again. Look at the different circles, look at the different shapes, look at the different lines, look at all of the different things that we have that we've pointed out as variety. Not all of them are going to be creating the color scheme, but everything that is creating variety here is helping to set up the color scheme. And so I point this out because I want you to understand that variety might be what makes this an interesting artwork and makes you really like the artwork and want to dissect it and understand it. But variety is not what is making this seem cohesive. There is something that the artist is doing to make that variety cohesive, so that it still becomes a unified composition in the end, so that it seems like a complete piece, that it still seems organized. The next one that we have is balance. And balance is literally, I need you to understand this, visual weight. We might describe it as being weighted to the bottom right-hand corner of the artwork if it's two-dimensional. And with this, I use this example because the majority of artwork is weighted to the bottom right-hand corner. And we're not taught this in art school. This is not something that is taught to artists. It's just something that looks right, and artists are naturally drawn to it. It doesn't mean that it has to be that way and it can't be done properly another way, but it will happen again and again. So balance has to do with how elements are arranged in the composition according to its visual weight. So notice here we've got symmetrical, meaning that it's same on the both sides, asymmetrical, not the same on the both sides. But this is assuming that we're discussing visual weight. So the visual weight is the same on both sides. The visual weight is not the same on both sides. Radial balance will look symmetrical, but when you look at it, you will realize that the visual weight is aligned in a circular fashion that's radiating from the center. And then we have structural balance, and this deals with whether artwork that are three-dimensional can stand on their own, that the artist has created the artwork in terms of its weight properly so that it can actually bear its own weight, that it can stand up. Now, structural balance is not always needed to be discussed. So this is not something that there's a lot of things that we assume will stand up, right? Like your house has to pass lots of codes before you can move into it. So I hope that none of you walk into your house, praying that it will stand up, right? That's not something that you do. Because if it is, you guys are insane and probably should find another place to live. So when it comes to architecture, you don't normally discuss structural balance unless there's something interesting to discuss about it. When it comes to three-dimensional sculptures, we assume that the artwork will stand up, right? That it's not going to fall down. Now, if it looks like it's defying gravity, then yes, for sure, we absolutely discuss the structural balance because the artist has done something extraordinary. When we discuss Greek sculpture, the Greeks were amazing craftsmen. They could carve out of stone the human figure, and they could have it balance on the palms of its feet and not need a base. And there really hasn't been many artists that since the Greek times that could do the same thing. It's extraordinary. The Romans came directly after them, and they were also incredible craftsmen, but they were not as good as the Greeks. And you will notice a big difference between Greek sculpture and Roman sculpture is that Roman sculpture needs a base on it. They relied on that base because they couldn't get the structural balance the same as the Greek artist. Now, most Greek work has been lost because when the Romans took over, they destroyed it. But when you look at that work, it's an incredible thing to look at. That's a time where you want to talk about the structural balance, when you're in awe of the way it stands. Now, when we talk about symmetrical balance, I want you to understand that this is not math class where you have to put a mirror down the center and make sure that it would look the exact same on the other side, because we're discussing the visual weight. So if the visual weight appears the same on both sides, then we will accept it. Now, this is an artwork where we will look at it, as having symmetrical balance. But what I want you to notice is that on the left side, the robes start to fall higher than on the right side. But that small shift is not enough to warrant asymmetrical balance. Now, this is a photograph, so that it's just a documentation of the actual sculpture. The people at the bottom are not a part of the artwork. They are just there taking pictures of the sculpture. Now here we have Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, and this was done in 1495 to 1498. We have an artwork that does look balanced. In terms of it being symmetrically balanced, I know it's not the exact same on both sides, but it is very close. We've got 6 disciples on the left, we've got 6 disciples on the right. Excuse me, 6 people on the left, 6 people on the right. Notice that the actual building itself is in perfect symmetry. And this was done actually with linear perspective. And if you draw lines down from the ceiling and from, you will find that the vanishing point is actually Jesus's brain. Now, some of the rules that come with balance here will explain that warmer colors appear heavier than cooler colors. But a object that is lumped together, like the larger shape on the left created by the people, because they are kind of closer to each other, also is heavier than the objects the people on the right seem more singular. So there are more warm colors on the right, balancing out that compound shape on the left. So if you look at it, and if you just take a moment and actually look at the artwork, does one side look, and I mean visually, we're not weighing it in terms of trying to figure out how much it would literally weigh. Visually, do you notice how it doesn't, if it visually were on a teeter-totter, it looks the same on both sides? And that's why we would call this symmetrically balanced. And if that's really hard for you, you can also call it near symmetry, as in it's close to symmetry. Now here we have an asymmetrical artwork. This artwork is, like I warned, weighted to the bottom right-hand corner of the artwork. And you notice that the cooler colors are on the left, the warmer colors are on the right, and that does give more weight. But asymmetrically balanced artwork does not mean that it is not balanced. I need you to understand this. It means it's balanced in another way. I want you to look at the bridge in the middle ground with the people and like the donkey or the horse with the person on it. Notice how the bridge and those people help balance the weight of the land in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, what we call that is a counterweight. So when an artist uses asymmetrical balance, they will put most of the weight on one side. And here we have it weighted in the bottom right-hand corner, and there is a counterweight, and you point out what it is. It is that there is a counterweight on the bridge of the people near the left-hand side that is balancing the weight on the right-hand side. You need both of these two things to explain how the artist has balanced this artwork. Now, when it comes to things in the background, like the mountain there, notice how, even though it's, sometimes students think that that could be a counterweight, but keep in mind visually, because we know it's so far away, that also takes away the weight of it. So the further things are away, the less they appear to weigh. The closer they are to us, the more that they're going to appear. Now here's some of the rules, but before we read them, I'm actually going to show you a short video.
Explore. Achieving balance. What are the visual weights of forms and colors, and how does an artist go about balancing them? As with design itself, there are no rules, only principles. Here are 3 principles concerning the balance of forms. First, a large form is heavier and more attention-getting than a small form. However, 2 or more small forms can balance one large form. In this work, note that the single heavy figure of Christ balances the group of smaller figures at the right. Second, a form gathers visual weight as it nears the edge of a picture. In this way, a small form near an edge can balance a larger form near the center. In this painting by Jan Vermeer, notice how the loaf of bread in the basket balances the larger form of the kitchen maid. Third, a complex form is heavier than a simple form. In this famous work by Michelangelo, the depiction of God and his attendants at the right creates a complex form which is heavier than the large simple form of Adam on the left. However, here the work appears balanced because Adam is anchored to the base of the composition while God is soaring. The introduction of color complicates these principles. Here are 4 color principles that may counteract the 3 principles of form just given. First, warm colors are heavier than cool colors. A single small yellow form can therefore balance a large dark blue form. In this work by Francisco Goya, The warm yellow and white of the figure with upraised arms on the left balances the cooler mass of the soldiers on the right. Second, warm colors tend to advance toward the viewer, while cool colors tend to recede. This means that when considering two similar forms of opposing temperature, the warmer will be visually heavier because it seems closer to the viewer. In William Harnett's A Smoke Backstage, the warm yellow of the folded newspaper advances more than the receding blue of the tobacco pack. The artist heightened this effect by also placing the newspaper lower and seemingly closer to the viewer. The color contrast heightens the distance between the yellow and blue forms. Third, intense colors are heavier than weak or pale colors. In Jan van Eyck's painting, the intensity of Mary's red cloak outweighs the lighter colors of the landscape beyond the window. It also outweighs the darker garment of the chancellor at the left, but here the artist added complexity and highlights to the figure for balance. Finally, the intensity and therefore the weight of any color increases as the background color approaches its complementary hue. Thus, on a green background, a small simple red form can balance a large complex blue form. In this pastel drawing by Edgar Degas, the yellow-orange curtain in the upper left stands out against the blue wall and floor that form the background to the work. The curtain also balances the darker shapes on the right. Although guidelines such as these are interesting to study and can be valuable to an artist if he or she gets stuck, they are really laboratory examples. The truth is that most artists rely on a highly developed sensitivity to what looks right to arrive at a dynamic balance. Simply put, a work of art is balanced when it feels balanced.
And that's completely true. Now, your eyes work the same as an artist's, and now artists have an extra sensitivity to this, but the artwork should make sense. The artworks that you guys are looking at will be balanced. You are not trying to determine if it is balanced or isn't balanced. You are trying to determine how it's balanced and why it's balanced. And that is your job as the evaluator. And so it's important to understand these principles because knowing these principles can help you to explain why it's balanced or how it's being used by the artist, what decisions they made to create that balance. And that's why I teach you this. Now here we have a Tibetan mandala by Kalachakra Sera, painted in the Sera Monastery in Tibet. And this has radial balance because it is radiating towards the center. Now, this is supposed to represent a Buddhist's path towards nirvana. And if you look carefully, it is an actual monastery. Like you can see it in here. And what you will notice is that it works as a path closer and closer towards the center, and the center is supposed to be nirvana as they walk their path in life towards that goal in their religion. But if you look at it briefly, you might think that this has symmetrical balance. And if you said that, you would not get it correct because you would be wrong. The artist did not choose to create symmetry here. The artist chose to create radial balance. Now this also has radial balance. It may not be centered exactly, but the staircase is winding and it is radiating towards the center of the staircase itself. And so it still has radial balance. Now, if that's really hard for you to understand, the other reason why I show this is because We're looking at an architectural element, the staircase. Think of the photograph as documentation. Not all photographs are the intended artwork, right? They are documenting the artwork we're looking at. And so if you imagine the staircase as the artwork and the photograph as a means to view it, that radial balance will make more sense. I explain this because a lot of times when students look at artwork in museums, they will talk about, say, a sculpture and the glass it's encased in and what it's been placed on and things like that. But those are not things that the artist created. The artist created the one individual specific sculpture, and the museum placed it in those specific parameters to protect the artwork. Now here we have a sculpture by Matt Calderwood called Found Objects, and this is one where you would obviously want to talk about structural balance because it looks like it should not stand. Now there are no gimmicks here, there's no hidden wires, this is not a photograph done in Photoshop, this is a legitimate sculpture that is just two wine glasses, two balls, and two shovels that have been placed so correctly, so like specifically, that they are able to balance in this way and stand up. Matt Calderwood specializes in these types of sculptures, and though this one didn't survive, in this specific show that he did, it actually went through I think it was an 8 earthquake that was like a level 8, and this is the only one that fell over out of all of the different ones that he placed like this in the show because they were so well balanced. So we had to set this one back up, but the rest were good to go. Now this is Isamu Noguchi. This is Red Cube in New York. And this, of course, is one that you would want to talk about structural balance because, again, it is kind of defying gravity, right? Now, one of the things that's also very interesting about the proportions here is it does look like a cube, so it has that symmetry to it. But the only reason it has the symmetry at the place where we would stand is because Noguchi actually distorted the proportions, so it is actually not symmetrical, so that it would look like a perfect cube based on where we're standing. So that's actually something that's quite unique about this artwork. And then we have contrast. Now, contrast doesn't just refer to the Photoshop concept that you guys already know about. It actually just means opposites. So that can be dark versus light, but it can also be the artist using something big and something little in the artwork. Organic versus geometric shapes in the artwork. Smooth versus rough textures in the artwork. Think about Via Selman's sculpture we looked at last week to discuss texture, right? We've got that actual rough rock texture, and then we've got that smooth texture of the bronze that looks identical to the rock because she's painted it to look like that. But that definitely has some contrast there, right? So here we've got the dark versus light. This is Ansel Adams' Clearing Winter Storm, circa 1937. He actually uses a special red filter that he became really well known for, and people are still trying to emulate his artwork. But the red filter that he used is what is bringing out all of the rich textures. So we've got the small trees versus the larger trees here. We've got some smoother textures versus some rougher textures. But we also have that dark versus light that you already understand. Now here we have Vincent van Gogh's The Bedroom from 1889, and this is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And here we have big versus small. We've got the big bed in the small room, contrasting the smaller objects that we see here on the table, even the smaller chairs, the smaller paintings, things like that. And then we have a double complementary color scheme here. So that actually is considered contrast because they are opposites on the color wheel. So if you remember, I showed you that this is actually originally violet. So violet and yellow, and then green and red. And so those two things we've got, those two different sets of complements create contrast as well. Now these all work together. So we've got emphasis and rhythm. Focal point and subordination are a part of emphasis, and directional forces work in rhythm. So I'm going to discuss all of these, and then we'll look at some artwork. So we have emphasis, and emphasis is literally where your eyes are drawn in the artwork. It's where the artist wants there to be attention drawn. Now focal point is where your eyes rest, usually. This is the most important part of the artwork. And there can only be one focal point, and I know the book doesn't say that. I know that the book talks about multiple focal points, but the way that I explain it, because this will make a lot more sense to you, is there can be multiple points of emphasis and then one focal point. If you think of the focal point as the most important part of the artwork, the most important point of emphasis, the one that helps you understand the story, and then the other ones will be the areas where attention is drawn that you notice that will lead you to that. So it's almost like you're getting the building blocks of the story and then the main point. Think of it like the best advice I can always give is if you're really struggling for that, think about the title. What's the title? The title has all sorts of information. You know, if the title is the title referring to something specific in the artwork, and if it is that the focal point? More than likely, it is. The focal point is that area of emphasis or that point of emphasis that if taken out of the artwork's meaning would change completely. It would no longer make sense as an artwork. Like the meaning that the artist is emulating in it. Now usually, and this is not a hard and fast rule because artists love to break rules, usually the focal point is the lightest and brightest thing in the artwork. And the reason for this is because your eyes are automatically drawn to the lightest or brightest thing in an artwork. And so the artist will use that. The artist will often change the light around the focal point so that you're drawn to it more easily. You know, the artist wants you to be drawn to the points of emphasis. They want you to understand the story. They want you to see the focal point. And so they're not going to make that difficult. Now, so that the points of emphasis are clear, and the focal point is just the most important point of emphasis, there has to be subordination. If you're going to draw attention to certain areas, you have to have areas that are not going to draw your attention, that aren't going to be as interesting. So if you want a person to stand out and they have, say, a nice creamy African skin tone, you probably shouldn't put them on a dark brown background, right? If you want them to stand out, you need something that has less interest there. You need to pull your interest away from it. so that it creates some sort of contrast, so that it's not quite as interesting. You're not going to put a crazy pattern behind them because then people are going to look at the pattern instead of that person. So if every area in the artwork has the same level of visual interest, then there isn't any emphasis because there is no subordination. I need you to understand that emphasis and subordination are two sides of the same coin. Because if you have emphasis, you're going to have subordination. And so it is one principle. You can't point out the areas of emphasis and point out the areas of subordination, and that gives you two principles. Now you can point out the focal point, and you can point out the areas of subordination and get credit, but that's the way that this works. I just want you to really clearly understand. Rhythm works with emphasis. If there are two or more points of emphasis, an artwork has rhythm, because rhythm is literally how your eyes move through the work. And the artist gets you to move through the work through those points of emphasis. You're drawn to one place, and then you're drawn to another, and then you're drawn to another, and now you've moved through the work. And that's literally what rhythm is. You get credit for rhythm by saying the first thing I noticed was this, or the first place I was drawn was this, and then I was led here by this thing, and I noticed this, and then the last thing I noticed was this, and then this thing led me back up to the first point of emphasis, or it didn't. Usually it creates some sort of triangle or circular, so you get trapped in it, but sometimes it doesn't. But that's how you get credit for rhythm and we're going to practice it. Now, directional forces is the way we look at the art. These are the guiding paths. So the rhythm is how your eyes are moving through the work through those points of emphasis, and the guiding path is how you get from one point of emphasis to another. So there might be a fallen tree that kind of creates almost like a directional line from one to the next. That's really a clear directional force guiding you there. So let's take a look at this. So this is Roger van der Weyden, and this is The Descent from the Cross. Now, when we look at this artwork, and because we know that it's a Christian religious artwork, most students automatically assume Jesus is the focal point. He's in the center of the artwork. He's really he draws your attention right away, so you're pulled into him. But do you stop there? Is it where your eyes rest? Is it where your eyes finish? Is it where the painting, while you're reading it, stops? And the answer to that is no, right? Now, notice we've got Jesus' arm here, and it leads you right down to this woman in blue. The woman in blue is Jesus' mother, Mary. And a lot of times in medieval and Renaissance artwork, you're going to see that Mary, Jesus' mother, is dressed in blue. It's one of the ways that they identify her in artwork often, because blue is a color for peace. And so this arm becomes a directional line or a directional force leading us to Mary. So now we know that we've got a point of emphasis here. Notice that there's repetition here too, because we've got her body in the same pose as Jesus's. Her arm, her body, her hand, right? So she, if you notice her skin tone, her face is ghost white. Now, this helps make the emphasis more clear. It helps make it very clear that these are our 2 points of emphasis. They're in the same position. The other thing that I want you to look at now is where are the people in the artwork looking? So I know that she is looking down, she's praying, right? But he is looking at Mary, he is looking at Mary, she is looking at Mary. She is devastated, she just is covering her eyes. He is looking down, he is looking down, and he is looking away. But look, it's almost like he's looking away almost in shame. But notice how the majority of people here are looking at Mary, not Jesus. So this can also be a directional force. So where the other people in an artwork are watching, where they are looking, where they they're giving you a sign, they're guiding you towards what you should be looking at, right? And so this helps you to understand that not only do we have his arm leading us down, and there's nothing in her that leads us back up, right? Her comes here, but it doesn't lead us back up to him. There's not something that completes the cycle. So we're led down to her. The other people are looking at her and not Jesus. And so this shows us that Jesus actually is a point of emphasis, but Mary is the focal point. And here I actually explain the story of the descent from the cross. If there's any good Catholics listening, or they know this story really well because it's a part of the celebration of Easter in this. But she, as soon as her son is taken off of the cross, Mary faints because she's distraught. And all of the attention is on Mary. You have to keep in mind that when Christ dies, there's 3 days where everyone is trying to figure out how they're going to survive without him. And so for 3 days, Jesus is not the focus of Christianity in this in the story. But the descent from the cross is a part of the celebration in Easter. When you go through the stations of the cross, this is actually one of them, and you're taught this in Catholicism. In Christianity, this is all something that you learn. And so which at the time this was created, everyone viewing the artwork knew where the focus would have been. Because in the Middle Ages, this is the only thing that's important. They are only concerned about the afterlife. They are only concerned about getting to heaven. Death is such a part of their lives. They could die at any moment for so many different reasons that their only focus was getting to heaven. And so this is something that they would clearly know and understand just by looking at it. Just by understanding the title, they would know exactly what the story was here. So the other things that I want to point out, they are the lightest and brightest things here. He is lighter, but her fabric is brighter, a brighter pigment. Think about this in terms of the brightness, the chroma, the saturation. We do have some red, and red is a very bright color, but notice that this is, the saturation here is diluted from the blue that you see. The blue itself is more brilliant, than any of the other colors that are in the artwork. Then the red or the green here, we've got that brilliant blue. And so she really comes forward. She really stands out because of the brilliance of that blue. So the rest of the painting becomes subordinate to Jesus and Mary. Most notably, the background is subordinate, but the other people are subordinate to them as well. Notice they don't have as much detail, they don't have as much color. There is a lot more emphasis being put on the two of them for good reason. And then we have one of my favorite artworks. This is Roy Lichtenstein's Drowning Girl from 1963. This is part of pop art. So a lot of people know the other side of pop art, where we've got Andy Warhol painting soup cans and other things like that, Marilyn Monroe and things. But the other side of pop art is a celebration of comics, really. And Roy Lichtenstein is kind of the father of this side of it. And this is one of my favorites. I don't care. I'd rather sink than call Brad for help. This is in 1963 at the height of feminism. And he took this from a DC comic. And originally you had she's in the water, and you have the actual Brad standing on the side of the water, not the water, the land, next to the water, and he changed the text so it would be, so he cut Brad and the land out to crop it to make it more intense, and then he changed the text itself so that it would also suit his purposes. Roy Lichtenstein was a big supporter in feminism, and a lot of his artwork has to do with this. Now, think about the statement that's coming through here. What she's saying, I realize she's basically saying I would rather die than call Brad for help, right? But really, if you break that down, she's saying that I will solve this myself. I would rather sink, I would rather fail than let a man help me, because I can do this myself. And that's really where, at the beginning of feminism, where it was really, well, this is not obviously the beginning of feminism, but in the height of feminism in the 1960s, where they were fighting for equality, they had to show that they could do anything themselves, even if it meant that they would drown, right? They had to do it all on their own, because that's how they were going to get their message across. That's how they were going to help the women of the future. And so that's really where this painting's power comes in. Now, if we look at this artwork, we notice a couple of things, right? The blue hair is bright, it's bold, and it draws us in. It frames the face. And so her face really becomes important. Now, I have an example here of how you might talk about this. And the reason I do this is because it really does help you understand things. And one of the things I want you to understand is it does talk about the focal point being the drowning girl, but I want you to understand that the further I go, I make it more and more clear what the true focal point is. The drowning girl is taking up the majority of the painting, right? She's taking up about like 80% of the painting, and this is a huge painting. So a focal point, right? Think about that, a point. You should be able to view all of it at once. And so that's awfully large. So when you look at the drowning girl, what part of her is the focal point? What directional forces lead you to the most important part? So we've got the hair framing the face, so it's going to be in the face. And then we also have the directional force of her her left hand here leading us up to her eyes, right? And so we've got the eyes here that really help us. It's really this face here and the tears in her eyes that you're really drawn to. So that becomes our clear focal point. Now we have another point of emphasis, so we definitely have rhythm because we're also drawn to the words. So like our next point of emphasis would be the thought bubble. And how do we get there? The directional force are the three little bubbles that are leading us to them, right? So we're drawn to her, we're drawn to her face, we've got the directional forces here that bring us to the focal point, and then we've got this directional force, that brings us right up to the words. And so this is how it's clear of what we see. So the focal point in this work is the drowning girl. Her tears hold our focus. So notice I'm not saying that it's the entire girl. I'm making it very clear what the part of the girl that is the focus. Her blue hair and left hand are directional forces that lead our attention to her. The three circles that lead to the second point of emphasis, the thought bubble. The circles are also a directional force letting you know she'd rather drown than ask Brad to save her. The water around her is subordinate to the girl. Notice the girl is in color and the water is in black and white. And even the thought bubble itself is in black and white. But if you compare the white in the thought bubble to the white of the wave, notice the thought bubble is brighter than the wave. So we are really, he's really showing us what's important in the artwork and what is less important. And so this is your lesson. And if you have any questions, make sure that you've written them down and be prepared to ask them in our next class. Have a good one.